Welcome to Bookish Mind, Season 3, Episode 7. Today, we explore how empathy shapes not only our relationships, but the very foundation of our morality and humanity. Welcome back to the deep dive.
Today, we are plunging into something absolutely fundamental, really, to the human experience, empathy. We're trying to go beyond just, feeling for someone to really exploring what it means to truly understand what they're feeling, almost like stepping into their shoes.
And our guide for this journey is an incredible chapter from Daniel Goleman's work on emotional intelligence. He pulls together just a ton of research to really get at the roots and the huge impact of empathy.
It's almost like he's mapping it out for us, this internal landscape.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack the science behind it. Where does this ability come from? How does it develop as we grow up? What happens when it's just missing? And crucially, why it's so vital for, everything from our personal lives to our moral compass, even society itself. All right, let's dive in then. To get a handle on what empathy is, the material kicks off with a really striking example. A surgeon named Gary. Brilliant guy, amazing surgeon, but described as alexithymic. He really struggled not just figuring out his own feelings, but he was completely missing the emotional signals from others, like his fiancée, Ellen.
Yeah, and Gary's story is so powerful because it highlights something fundamental. Goleman argues, basically, that empathy starts with self-awareness. If you're emotionally tone-deaf to yourself, like alexithymics are, well, you just can't tune into what others are broadcasting emotionally.
You can't hear the music from others if you don't recognize the notes in yourself.
Precisely. And so much of that music, as the source points out, is nonverbal.
Right. Tone of voice, gestures, facial expressions. Even silence can say a lot. It suggests something like, 90% or more of an emotional message isn't in the words.
Exactly. And we often pick up on this stuff without even realizing it, subconsciously.
Which leads to some fascinating research, like Robert Rosenthal's PONS test, the profile of nonverbal sensitivity.
Oh, yeah, that was clever. Using video clips but blocking certain channels so you had to read emotions just from the face, or maybe just the body language, or only the tone of voice. Really isolating those nonverbal skills.
And the results were pretty clear, weren't they? People who scored higher on PONS, who were better at reading these cues.
They tended to be better adjusted overall, more popular, more outgoing, definitely more sensitive. And interestingly, women generally did better than men on average.
And improving these skills was actually linked to having better relationships. That makes a lot of sense.
It does. And here's a really key point that comes up again and again in emotional intelligence work. This ability, this nonverbal sensitivity, it's largely separate from things like IQ or SAT scores or how well you do in school.
So it's a different kind of smarts.
Absolutely. They even did PONS tests with kids. The children who were good nonverbal readers, even if they had average IQs, they were more popular with their peers and more emotionally stable. It really greases the wheels in social situations.
Okay, so if the skill is so important but separate from academics, where does it even come from? How does empathy start to develop? The material traces it way back, like right to infancy, using research from people like Martin L. Hoffman.
Yeah, the earliest hint they found was in newborns. Just hearing another baby cry could make them upset. It's like this automatic shared distress. Not really differentiated yet.
Almost like an emotional reflex?
Kind of. Then, a few months later, babies react to someone else's upset as if it's happening to them. So another baby tries. They might start crying too.
Ah, okay.
But then around age 1, something shifts. They start to get that the misery isn't actually theirs, but they're still pretty confused about what to do about it.
Right, like that example of the 1-year-old bringing his own mom over to comfort his crying friend, even though the friend's mom was right there. Sweet, but confused.
Exactly. And you see them trying to figure it out through what used to be called motor mimicry, way back in the 1920s. It's not quite sympathy. A toddler might copy someone hurting their finger, like clutch their own finger.
Yeah.
Or wipe their own eyes, even if they aren't crying, when they see someone else teary.
Like they're physically trying on the feeling.
Sort of, yeah. Maybe trying to understand it by embodying it. But that mimicry starts to fade around 2.5. And that's a really key time. Kids begin to understand that other people's feelings are separate from their own.
And they get better at actually comforting someone appropriately.
Right. Like little Jenny in the example, offering cookies or a toy or patting the crying baby's head. They start to target their response better.
Okay.
But this is also where you start to see kids diverging a bit in how sensitive they are. And research, like from Radke Yarrow and Zahn Waxler, really points to parenting style playing a role.
How?
Well, kids seem to develop more empathy when discipline focused on the effect their actions had on others, like saying, "Look how sad you made her feel," instead of just calling the behavior naughty.
Focusing on the feeling caused, not just the rule broken.
Exactly. And kids also learn by watching how adults around them react when other people are upset. It's modeling.
That makes sense. And this idea of feeling seen and understood connects to another really powerful concept the material brings in. Attunement, from Daniel Stern's research, right?
Yes, attunement.
Hmm.
And it's crucial. It's not just mimicking what the child does. It's about reflecting back their inner feeling state.
So not just copying the baby shaking a rattle, but matching the excitement level in your voice or expression.
Precisely. Matching the intensity or the feeling tone. It could be matching a squeal of delight or the rhythm of their babbling. These aren't exact copies, but they resonate with the child's internal experience.
And these moments, even tiny ones, they add up.
Stern argues they add up profoundly. These countless little moments of feeling felt by someone else, of being emotionally connected, they give the child this deep sense of being understood.
The source uses that study of the twins, Mark and Fred, to show the impact, right?
Yeah, it's striking. Mark's mother was attuned. She'd let him look away naturally during interaction, sensing his need for a break. Fred's mother was misattuned. She'd kind of force eye contact, making him uncomfortable, and he learned to avert his gaze from her.
And that had long-term effects.
Apparently so. Fred grew up more fearful, tended to avoid eye contact generally. Mark, who had that attuned mother, was more confident with eye contact.
Wow.
Stern's point is that these thousands of repeated moments, these micro-interactions of attunement or misattunement in infancy, they'll build the blueprint for how we expect relationships to feel later on, whether we expect to be understood or misunderstood. He even suggests they might be more powerful than big, dramatic life events.
It's amazing to think the foundation for adult intimacy could be laid in interactions we can't even consciously remember. Stern even connects it to adult life, saying that, peak experiences in lovemaking involve that deep mutual empathy, sensing the other's inner world, that shared desire, being in sync.
A powerful analogy. But, as you hinted, there's a downside. Misattunement. The material makes it clear that when a child's feelings are consistently ignored or misunderstood, it's deeply upsetting for them. Studies showed infants getting really dismayed when mothers consistently underresponded.
And if that happens over and over?
Well, the source suggests it can be really damaging. The child might learn to just stop expressing certain emotions, or maybe even stop feeling them if they're never validated or met. Entire ranges of feelings could potentially get shut down or obliterated, as the text puts it.
That's quite a thought, obliterated.
Yeah. And kids can also sort of catch the emotional atmosphere. Babies with depressed mothers often mirrored that sadness or anger and showed less curiosity. Or a baby whose excitement was always met with a flat response might become more passive over time.
That sounds pretty grim. Is there any way back from that?
Well, yes, thankfully. The source does offer hope. It talks about reparative relationships later in life, good friends, supportive relatives, maybe therapy. These can offer new experiences of being understood and help reshape those early patterns.
So early experiences are powerful, but not necessarily destiny.
Exactly. That's the idea. Some therapeutic approaches, like certain psychoanalytic ones, actually see therapy itself as a kind of corrective emotional experience, offering that consistent attunement, that mirroring of the inner state that might have been missing earlier.
Okay, interesting. Let's shift gears a little. What about the biology? Where does empathy live in the brain?
Well, early clues came from people with brain injuries, brain lesions. Damage in certain spots in the right frontal lobe, for instance, could mess up someone's ability to understand the emotion in someone's voice, even if they got the words. Other right hemisphere damage could impair their ability to show emotion through their own tone or gestures. And these areas have strong links to the limbic system, the brain's emotional centers.
And later research narrowed it down more.
Yeah, reviews like Leslie Brothers pointed towards the amygdala, that almond-shaped structure involved in fear and motion, and its connections to the visual cortex, which makes sense for how we'd see and interpret emotional expressions.
Any animal studies supporting this?
Oh yeah, some powerful ones. Rhesus monkeys, for example.
Yeah.
They found that monkeys could learn to press a lever to avoid an electric shock for another monkey just by seeing the fear on that other monkey's face on a TV screen. That's a pretty clear empathic response.
Wow, okay.
And get this, researchers even found specific neurons in monkeys' visual cortex that fired only when they saw particular emotional expressions, like a fear grimace or a submissive posture.
So the brain seems kind of pre-wired to recognize and respond to these signals, like it's biologically given, at least partly.
Seems that way. And think about this. Monkeys who had the connection severed between their amygdala and visual cortex became social outcasts. They couldn't read the emotional cues needed to function in their group. Shows how vital this is for survival, even.
Okay, bring it back to humans. There was that study with married couples by Robert Levinson.
Right. They had couples discuss difficult topics. The couples who were best at guessing what their partner was feeling during the argument were the ones whose bodies were physiologically tracking their partner.
Meaning?
Meaning their own heart rate changes or their sweat responses actually mirrored their partner's physiological state, second by second. There was this physical synchrony happening.
So being truly empathic involves a kind of physical resonance too.
It suggests that, yeah, and it also implies that to really pick up on subtle cues from someone else, your own emotional brain needs to be relatively calm and receptive. If you're totally flooded with your own anger or anxiety, you just don't have the bandwidth to tune into the other person's signals.
Your own noise drowns them out. Makes sense. Okay, so we've looked at development, the brain. Now let's zoom out. Empathy and ethics. Morality. The source brings in that John Donne quote, "Never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee."
Yeah, that really captures it, doesn't it? The idea that another person's suffering resonates within us. Goleman argues, based on Hoffman's work, that this capacity is the root of caring, the foundation of morality.
How so?
Hoffman's argument is that our ability to empathize with potential victims, to feel distressed by their potential pain or danger or deprivation, the shared distress, is what actually drives our moral judgments and motivates us to help, to act altruistically.
So it's that natural progression we talked about earlier, from the infant sharing distress to trying to soothe someone to realizing feelings are separate, and then later understanding the suffering of whole groups, the poor, the oppressed.
Exactly. That deepening understanding, often developing in adolescence, fuels moral convictions about fairness and justice. Empathy also connects to things like empathic anger, feeling outrage when others are treated unjustly. It's linked to intervening when you see someone victimized. And people higher in empathy tend to favor distributing resources based on need.
Okay, but what about the flip side? What happens when that empathy just isn't there? The source really delves into the darker side here.
It does. It uses the example of Eric Eckert, involved in the Tonya Harding-Nancy Kerrigan attack. His remorse apparently only kicked in after he saw the TV footage of Kerrigan crying in pain. Like the empathy switch was flipped by that powerful visual, but way too late.
A chilling example.
And tragically, this profound lack of empathy is described as a core feature in many violent criminals. Rapists, child molesters, domestic abusers. It's this absence that lets them create these awful justifications for their actions.
Like she wanted it, or I was just showing affection, or it was just discipline. They block out the victim's reality.
Yes. They essentially silence the victim's emotional world in their own mind to allow the act to happen. The source describes the cycle for some sex offenders. Feeling upset leads to fantasy, which gets sexualized, offers temporary relief, but then depression follows. A key part is detaching emotionally, seeing the victim through the fantasy, not as a real person with feelings. Registering the victim's actual pain would shatter the fantasy.
Is there any way to address that?
Well, some newer treatments try. William Pithers developed perspective-taking therapy. Offenders have to confront the victim's experience, read their accounts, watch videos, right from the victim's point of view, even role-play being the victim.
The goal being to make denial impossible.
Essentially, yes, to force them to confront the pain they caused and hopefully strengthen their motivation to control their urges. The source mentions it has shown some promise, reducing reoffense rates in some studies.
But then there are psychopaths or sociopaths. The source seems less optimistic there.
Right. They're often described as superficially charming, but fundamentally lacking remorse, empathy, compassion, conscience. Sadistic serial killers are the extreme example, often described as glib liars, master manipulators, utterly incapable of genuine care.
That story of Pharaoh, the teenage gang member bragging about crippling a mother and baby.
It's terrifying. The nightmare face he showed the interviewer, conveying this absolute void of caring about the immense suffering he caused, or even his own future. Just nothing.
Now, the material adds some nuance, right? Lack of empathy isn't always psychopathy. It could be learned dissociation, like in torturers, or maybe a survival trait in violent settings.
True. And it highlights a specific, disturbing finding about some calculating wife batterers. Not the ones who lash out impulsively, but the ones who use violence coldly to control. As their anger rises, their heart rate actually drops.
Drops. That's counterintuitive.
It suggests physiological calm, cold calculation during the abusive act, a terrifying detachment rather than being overwhelmed by emotion.
And researchers like Robert Hare studying psychopaths suspect there might be an underlying neural difference.
Yeah, his research suggests possible differences in how their brains process emotional language, maybe more shallowly. And crucially, they often don't show the normal fear response when facing punishment.
So if they don't fear consequences.
Hare argues they aren't deterred. And if they don't really experience fear or pain typically themselves, maybe they literally can't feel empathy for the fear and pain of their victims.
A potential biological component. But the source is careful here, isn't it?
Extremely careful. It stresses that finding potential biological patterns in some criminals absolutely does not mean all criminals are biologically flawed or that there's some kind of criminal gene.
Right. Lack of empathy, even if it has biological roots sometimes, is just one piece of a very complex puzzle. Psychological factors, social factors, economic ones, they all play a role.
Exactly. It's never presented as the sole cause, just one important and sometimes chilling factor.
Wow. Okay, so we've really covered a huge amount of ground, from defining empathy and its nonverbal language, tracing it all the way back to infancy, seeing the power of attunement or the damage of misattunement,
Yeah.
dipping into the brain science, connecting it to our moral core, and then confronting the really difficult reality of its absence.
Yeah, this deep dive really shows, I think, that empathy isn't just some fuzzy, nice-to-have emotion. It seems absolutely foundational. Foundational for connection, for learning, for justice, for preventing cruelty. It starts with biology, but it's profoundly shaped by early experience. Although, importantly, there's that glimmer of hope for repair later on.
So for everyone listening, what does this mean for you? You know, thinking about your own relationships, how you read people, those nonverbal signals we talked about, how you interact maybe with kids in your life, how you respond to suffering you see in the world.
And maybe the biggest question is this leaves us with is this. If empathy is this blend of biology and experience, and if lacking it can cause so much harm, what's our responsibility? Individually in our daily interactions and maybe collectively as a society, how do we get better at fostering attunement, cultivating that emotional understanding, especially those critical early years? How do we nurture this essential human quality?